ST, Towson, Baltimore, and WNST.net. It was an interesting weekend, Luke Jones. Our first weekend here in Baltimore without Joe Flacco. And it's fascinating to see how, Joe Flacco's no good. He can't play. He's awful. We got to bench him. We got to replace him. We got to draft for him. Oh, he's hurt. He's brittle. He makes too much money. He's cost the team the offense. And then in the aftermath, in the 48, 72 hours afterward, the Thanks Joe tributes start coming in a little bit more on the internet, and the little bit more of my wife with some barbs for we better make our Broncos Super Bowl plans next year in Miami, and other things like that. But, the aftermath of the Flacco thing, it's one thing when he's still here, and there's a notion that he can come back and beat the Chargers with some fourth quarter heroics and all that stuff. Then none of that takes place. Then he sort of dealt Valentine's week in the middle of the night. He'll show up next month in front of the Broncos statue and whatnot in orange, and we saw those Photoshops. But I thought the fans in the aftermath, there was some sense of, oh, yeah, there was that night in Denver, and there was that night in New Orleans. And, boy, we did win a lot of games around here. And there was that road trip to Foxborough and that game. And that time I ran into him in the supermarket, and he had 4 kids hanging from him, but he still took his picture with me. And all of the good parts of Joe Flacco, which, in the modern world of, where hatred is everywhere, I found it kind of nice that people were at least appreciative of Flacco.
Well, they should be. At some point in time, and we do this all the time, we take such strong positions, not saying you and me, but just people in general, take such strong positions on anything. You're either all the way on this side or you're all the way on the total opposite position. And you've really seen this on kind of a national level with Joe Flacco, with all of the kind of mocking of the is he elite kind of conversation. But you have these people, some people who have been very hesitant to criticize Joe at all sometimes here in town, and I've always kind of had an issue with that. And then you have that to me, probably a much larger group who treat this guy like he's been the worst quarterback in the NFL. And I think there's a happy medium here, and specifically for Ravens fans, specifically for people here in Baltimore who endured the years that led up to 2008, when you look at how many great defenses, frankly, were wasted because they so rarely found capable, competent quarterback play. I mean, Trent Dilfer was a good game manager for half of a season, and Steve McNair had a pretty good 2006 until he turned into a pumpkin in the postseason and was never the same and fell apart.
By the way, you mentioned something last week. I was listening to you and I was in the car in Catonsville listening to our conversation that we had earlier in the day, right? And I just, I was listening to hear the levels and hear what we're saying and hearing how the sound is and hearing how the signal's coming in on Frederick Road. And I glossed over it. You said in our last conversation, Kyle Bowler. God, when's the last time that we've legitimately thought about Kyle Bowler in Baltimore, Maryland? I mean, you know what I mean? And that's the worst of the worst, right? That was a failed quarterback who cost Brian Billick his job, who sort of set the franchise back, and then McNair kind of stepped in, ready to sort of drive it after 2 or 3 wasted seasons of waiting on Bowler in 4 and 5, right? Like, they had to come in and rescue it, and Jim Fossil and Neuheisel and everything that Billick did. But that's so ancient history, and that's the last quarterback, other than Lamar Jackson and the number 8 jerseys we all have around here. It's the last name, literally the last name. Like, there's been no one else. There's been 8 other quarterbacks, right? Tyrod, Beck, Mallet, Schaub. We can go through the names of these guys that were here for 5 minutes and lockered up next to Flacco but never walked on the field because that's how good Joe was. We had a quarterback. He was the only quarterback. We had it for a decade, man, and won a Super Bowl and made the playoffs 6 times, 7 times. Look, man, I don't know what else to say, but Kyle Bowler, we talk about these other guys, Kyle Bowler is the other side of that. And if 2 years from now we're looking for a quarterback again, that's what Lamar Jackson will be, right? I mean, not good enough. And Lamar's going to have to go out and win 10 or 11 games on his own next year.
Yeah, well, I mean, And a lot of that has to do with what else they're going to do. If we're going to be fair about that and say that Lamar Jackson needs to win 10 or 11 games, then Joe Flacco didn't win 10 or 11 games the last few years because it's a team game and because there are other issues at work. But getting back to what you said about Kyle Bowler, he's been brought up, but he's only been brought up in a punchline form. I mean, that's really where they were for the longest time. And one of my 12 Ravens thoughts that I put out there at WNST.net on the Joe Flacco trade was the fact that go back and look at the Ravens of the last decade. You had Terrell Suggs, Ed Reed, Haloti Ngata all come around from 2002 through 2006. You know, you're talking about 3 of the top 10 players in franchise history there. And Suggs and Reed, 2 top 5 players in the history of the franchise. None of those 3 had a single playoff win to their name until Joe Flacco showed up in 2008. And that's not to say that was all about Joe Flacco, because he benefited from playing with those guys as well. But it really does speak to some of the special defenses that this team had for a long time that were wasted because they didn't have anyone that could be capable, anyone that could be steady at the quarterback position for longer than maybe a handful of games at a time. And I just thought, and look, I mean, there's no, it's not a criticism or anything like that, but just imagine if Joe Flacco had come around 5 years sooner and say he had been coming out of Delaware in 2003 rather than the Ravens taking Kyle Bowler out of Cal and seeing how much that was it was a disaster. It didn't work out. I mean, he got hurt his rookie year and was never good for more than a game or 2 at a time and was really bad for large stretches. But you just think about the defense that they had at that point in time. Look at the running game that they had with Jamal Lewis. If they had had a quarterback like Joe Flacco 5 or 6 years sooner, we're probably sitting here talking about the Ravens at least having a good chance to have won another Super Bowl or 2. And who knows, maybe we're talking about the Ravens in a more similar light to, say, the Patriots. And not to say that they would have equaled them, but maybe they would have been more of their peer rather than, say, Indianapolis in the last decade.
Well, if you consider that Roethlisberger's going to the Hall of Fame, right, and that Breeze is going to the Hall of Fame, right? I mean, and what their accomplishments were, what their postseasons have looked like, what their Super Bowls have looked like, but they've had more 13-win seasons where they've had gaudy numbers and put a team on their back and, had 34 touchdowns and 8 interceptions and, all of those 5,000-yard passing seasons and all of that. That's been, I don't want to say a missing ingredient of the Ravens, but for these other franchises, I mean, I don't know that Phillip Rivers is going to go to the Hall of Fame or not, but or Matt Ryan or these guys that would measure against Flacco. Even Eli Manning, who's got 2 rings, right? Whether he's going to be a Hall of Famer or not, that's for me to have a conversation with these other 50 people that I have around here, and I'll have a few of them on this week. But the franchises themselves, when you consider the Ravens, you think defense, you never think offense, right? But when you think New Orleans, you think Drew Brees. When you think Pittsburgh, you think Roethlisberger and a bunch of wide receivers and different people. But you think Hall of Fame on those quarterbacks. We haven't had that here, and no one would say Flacco was a Hall of Fame quarterback. But there was that period from 8 through 14 where all he did was go to the playoffs and win playoff games.
Yeah, I mean, he had a very good run. And honestly, that run could have been a little bit longer had the organization done a better job building around him. And I think for me, over the last several days, in hearing some of fan reaction and seeing stuff on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and hearing various reporters here in town who covered Flacco over the last decade, it's not just the appreciation part, because there should have been the appreciation. If there wasn't, I mean, if you can't appreciate what he did over the first 5 years of his career specifically, then it goes back to what I say about if all you're judging your enjoyment and your appreciation on is strictly on winning championships, well, first of all, the guy won a championship, and he was the biggest reason why they won that Super Bowl in February 2013. But I think you look at what they were able to accomplish, and I pose this question: if you could go back and change anything about it, would you? And all right, you can go back and kind of say, well, maybe they shouldn't have paid him all that money, but they won a Super Bowl. They sure as heck weren't going to get rid of a Super Bowl MVP who had just come off a historic postseason run. Flacco just had as much leverage as you could possibly fathom in that position going into free agency a few weeks after winning the Super Bowl. And even over the last 5 years, and now 6 years, and last year we kind of counted as a half and half because he wasn't the quarterback at the end of the season when they made their run to make the playoffs. But it's not as though they were going 4-12 and they were out of it and they weren't competitive. I mean, they were, other than 2015 where injuries piled up, including for Flacco, they were right in the playoff race going into the last week or two of the season every single year. Now, that shouldn't be the standard that you're happy with, but if you're a little bit off, that's still it should still be a really enjoyable season to watch when you're competitive and relevant. And all right, you're not going to make the playoffs every single year, and we've talked about that. And yeah, some things need to get better around here as it relates to the Ravens because the standard over the last 5 or 6 years hasn't been what it was over the previous 5 years. But if you can't still take some enjoyment out of that and view that through the lens of that followed a 5-year period in which the Ravens had more success than they had at any other 5-year stretch in the history of the franchise by a large margin, then I don't know how you're going to be satisfied then, short of the Ravens becoming the next Patriots dynasty at some point in time. Which, by the way, I don't know if any team's ever doing.
Yeah, where's the measurement on that, bro? Right? I mean, let's measure ourselves against Michael Jordan, right? I mean, I don't.
Right.
And it's been a tough time for all of these guys, right? Like for every Sean Payton, for every Tom Coughlin, for every Mike Tomlin, and for every John Harbaugh who think that they would be going to the Hall of Fame and they would be knighted and they would have a statue. Instead, it's Belichick and Brady. And they haven't left much for anyone else, for the scraps and the crumbs that a Pete Carroll got himself one and that Philadelphia got one last year, whatever, and that John got one 6 years ago. In the modern era, you get one. Everyone else, you're just lucky to keep it away from Brady and Belichick because when you add all the rest of them up, they equal Brady and Belichick, literally.
Well, and that's where you kind of look at where the Ravens fit into that discussion. Now, the Ravens got their first one preceding what the Patriots did. And, of course, the Patriots won their first Super Bowl the following year in 2001. But I think you look at where the Ravens fall into that hierarchy with them, Pittsburgh. You look at what the Giants did, and I think the Giants probably, they kind of have a unique position because they beat the Patriots twice in the Super Bowl
and never lost.
Right, but beyond those types of teams, you're talking about a bunch of teams that have they've had a one-off. They've won one and they've been the one, but it's a select group, and that's where I think the Ravens and the fans specifically should take some satisfaction in that. And that, believe me, that's not to just completely forgive what's happened since the last Super Bowl. I've been very critical. I mean, my criticism has been for the organization. Joe owns part of that. Yeah, he could have played better at times. There's no question about that. But when you look at some of their shortcomings in building the roster, I just have some disappointment that I think there were a couple other really good seasons that could have been squeezed out of him that, frankly, they just weren't in a position to do that because of some poor decisions. And then when you have poor decisions on top of the fact that you do have a high-priced quarterback, it's magnified even more. So, but all that being said, how can you not look at the Joe Flacco era with fondness? How can you not go back to 2008? Let's go back 11 years right now, 11 years to the day when the Ravens were in a position knowing that they were looking for a quarterback.
And couldn't get Matt Ryan without dealing with two drafts.
They weren't going to get Matt Ryan without a top 3 pick.
By the way, whose ring finger is still nude. I just want to point that
out. Sure, but I'll also, again, team game and
winning's hard. I mean, Joe Flacco would have had nothing to do with Ray Lewis breaking down in coverage and missing Frank Gore at the goal line and me not writing a book and everyone around here having a nude ring finger. And John Harbaugh wouldn't be the coach anymore if that. Literally, right? One play any one of those 4 plays, if Colin Kaepernick boots,
sure.
you know what I mean? Like, the Ravens lose the Super Bowl, and every part of this story changes in the same way that if Jacoby Jones doesn't stop running and Flacco doesn't step up into the pocket and make the throw, we're not talking about it. So it really is one play. You talk about Flacco, man. Flacco had the Patriots beaten once on the fingertips of Lee Evans, twice on the foot of Billy Cundiff, then went up there and beat them and won the Super Bowl. Then went back 2 years later and had a 2-touchdown lead, and they lost. So there were a lot of things that Flacco did there that would have been aided by a lot of other things, including coaching, drafting, protection, a wide receiver, a kicker. He's always had a great punter, which has always been, and always pretty much had a great kicker, other than the one time that we didn't go to the Super Bowl because the kicker missed the kick, and because the coach didn't call a timeout as well. But in defending Flacco, I think there's a hell of a defense for him in retrospect. And I think the real defense will come as my hair gets more silver here, Luke, when 10, 12, 14 years from now, we look up and say, well, Lamar's won 3, so that made all the sense in the world. I don't think we're going to be saying that, Luke.
Well, we don't know. In the same way that if Joe Flacco was still the team's quarterback right now, I don't know if they'd be in any better position to win than they are right now. I mean, we've seen that this. I think one thing is clear, and I'll say this as someone who, I had very strong opinions about them drafting a quarterback last year. I think it was becoming more clear that this thing was starting to run its course, not solely because of Flacco, but because this organization had, whether you want to call it inability or refusal to sufficiently build around him. I don't think that was getting any better in that regard, and my biggest question is his durability, and that's going to be my question about him in Denver and whether there's a good enough supporting cast around him for that to be successful. I think it can be. I'm not at all convinced that it will be. So there's going to be unknowns for the Broncos with Flacco in a different way, but still unknowns nonetheless with Lamar Jackson here in Baltimore. So I don't want to bet against the kid at this point. I think it's too soon to be determined. Show me what he looks like in year 2. I mean, go back and watch Joe Flacco in 2008. We're not talking about a quarterback that you're necessarily confident is going to win a Super Bowl. I mean, the numbers.
There's a kid from Delaware that couldn't get on the field at Pittsburgh, right? Like, literally, he was a big kid with a big arm and a lot of hope. But, I mean, he had been reading Towson defenses and Hofstra defenses, for crying out loud, right?
Sure. And even though you can say, oh, well, the Ravens got to the AFC Championship, go back and look at his numbers that first postseason. He wasn't January Joe yet. He just wasn't. And anyone who tries to portray it that way, your memory is mistaken. I mean,
well, he's one of the reasons they lost in Pittsburgh in the championship.
Right. And I'm not trying to crush them for that.
Well, that was part of being 22 and playing in the NFL.
Exactly.
And Troy Polamalu's going to the Hall of Fame next year.
Right. So I think there are unknowns. And look, the time was going to be coming, whether it was now or whether it was sometime in the near future, that the Ravens were going to have to start thinking about this as far as a succession plan. And you never know. I mean, there's never a guarantee. I mean, there just isn't, unless Tom Brady falls into your lap when you've been happy with Drew Bledsoe for years. Unless you have that kind of a strange scenario, I mean, you're talking about a historic scenario there. You're always stepping into the unknown. And what happens with Lamar Jackson, we'll see. And that ultimately, a few years from now, if it doesn't work out, we'll also be looking to see what Joe Flacco's accomplished. And it might turn out that this is the right decision, but Lamar Jackson's not going to be a franchise Super Bowl winning guy, and Joe Flacco wasn't going to go anywhere else and win either. So it might just be one of those decisions that was fine, but didn't really work out all that, wasn't all that special for either side. But, just to go back to it, 11 years ago, the Ravens were looking for a quarterback. They were getting ready for the combine and pre-draft visits and workouts and things of that nature. And if you had told Steve Bisciotti, if you had told John Harbaugh, who was just a couple months on the job at this point, not even 1 month on the job at this point, if the kid that you were going to draft in a couple months from Delaware would win you a Super Bowl, would help you get to the playoffs 5 straight years and 6 out of 7 years, and okay, the second half of his tenure wouldn't work out as well from a team standpoint, they would sign up for that in blood, no questions asked. And yeah, that's all you need to know to kind of view this last decade of Joe Flacco here in Baltimore and to have fondness about that, because he's easily the best quarterback in franchise history. I know the bar wasn't exactly high, but he brought stability.
Well, it's not low now, though, right? I mean, the bar, you said the bar wasn't high. Well, the bar's high now.
It should be.
The bar's real high now. You're going to come here and play 11 years, make the playoffs 6, 7 times, and, win a Super Bowl? Yeah, you want to do that? Yeah, okay, well, come on in. We'd love to have you.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I mean, let's face it, the bar is much higher for Lamar Jackson than it was for Joe Flacco 11 years ago. And that's a good thing, by the way. And I'm not saying that as to be unfair to Lamar Jackson. I think people need to have patience. I think people need to give this kid a chance to have a full off season as the starter before we make these make these proclamations that he can't throw. He's not going to be the guy. I don't know. And it sounds like I'm sitting on the fence. And if that's the case, then so be it. I'm not a quarterback guru to the point where I can definitively tell you that he's going to be a really good quarterback or he can't play. There are things I like. There are things I don't like about him. There are things that are complete unknowns at this point. There's still the issue of whether you're going to put a good enough supporting cast around him, which is something I've been talking about for years now about this organization as it relates to its offense. But I think if you can, two things that you really take away from Joe Flacco: one, winning the Super Bowl and making the playoffs how many times he did over his first 7 years, and two, just raising that bar at that position. I mean, for the longest time, think about it. I mean, this organization had been in existence for over a decade before Flacco arrived, and the gold standard at the quarterback position, not talking statistically, because I know Vinny threw for 4,000 yards the first year, and Michael Jackson and Derek Alexander were 1,000-yard receivers, but the standard in terms of being successful and winning was what? Trent Dilfer being a game manager. I mean, that was the stand. That was the kind of the high point for Ravens quarterbacks, and well, Joe Flacco changed that dramatically, and he should be viewed as fondly as just about anyone in the history of this franchise. I mean, is he the best player in the history of the franchise? No. Is he arguably maybe not the most important, but at least in the top 3 or 4 most important? Absolutely. When you consider what this team was before he got here, how many great defenses were wasted, and then finally when he arrived, the Ravens started tasting prosperity on a consistent basis and then got to the pinnacle a few years after that.
He is Luke Jones. He is Baltimore Luke, and Luke at WNST.net. In the aftermath of all of the Raven stuff, we'll be here. So breaking news happens first out on the WNST Tech Service. That's all brought to you by Coons Ford of Security Boulevard. And, of course, Dennis is here from 3 until 5 on Thursday. So first it was Joe Flacco to Denver. We're going to learn more about Eric Weddle and Terrell Suggs and Marshall Yanda and C.J. Mosley and where the team is in the coming weeks. All of our WNST chats are brought to you by the enduring local support of all of our sponsors, including Curio Wellness Center in Timonium, the holistic spa with the top-of-the-line products and experienced pros. The flagship retail location there for the cannabis supplies, but also the education. Make sure you stop by, see them on York Road, just south of Timonium. See them at CurioWellness.com. Also, our friends at Strategic Factory, the marketing, the printing, the promotional goods of all kind, and the water in my orange cup. It's an orange cup because it's baseball season around here. Creating your masterpiece, whether it's marketing, printing, promotional goods, all in one shop, along with the strategy that goes along with it. You need Strategic Factory and strategicfactory.com. Also, our friends at LifeBridge Health Sports Medicine Institute. Dr. Craig Bennett going to be joining me here this week. I'm going to get my Stan Stasiak arm thing out that's made my arm a lot stronger. It's a lot better in yoga. Thank goodness for orthopedic doctors and keeping us together. We had Dr. Kevin Crutchfield on last week. LifeBridge Health Sports Medicine Institute here each and every week talking about getting you healthier. Especially as we get a little older, we get the creaks and the backs and the pains and all that good stuff. My wife's going to do a half marathon this year out with the Parisi folks and in conjunction with the folks at LifeBridge Health Sports Medicine Institute. So very thankful for their partnership around here this week. Nasty at WNST.net finds me. We're out each and every day in the buyatoyota.com audio vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device. Just download the TuneIn Radio app. You can listen to what you want, where you want, when you want. Kids call it podcasting. Nasty at WNST.net finds me. I am on Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn and Snapchat and Instagram and streaming live on our Facebook as well as our YouTube WNSTV channel. We are WNST.net, AM 1570 and WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.